Chapter 11. Peter Finds His Shadow. This is a piece from Peter Pan, a very famous fairy tale story, in which Peter goes to search for his shadow. For a moment, after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights by the beds of the three children continued to burn clearly. They were awfully nice little night lights, and one cannot help wishing that they could have kept awake to see Peter. But Wendy's light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other two yawned also, and before they could close their mouth, all the three went out. Now Mr. and Mrs. Darling, they were a couple and they had three children, and before they left in the night, the children went off to sleep after they had left, and they had night bulbs, 3 night lights, which were very beautiful. But the moment one went off, the other two also blinked and went off. Yawn means they were off, they were put off. Those lights went off. There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights, and in the time we have taken to say this, it had been in all the drawers in the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow, rummaging the wardrobe, and turned every pocket inside out. It was not really a light. It made the light by flashing about so quickly. But when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still exquisite, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinker Bell, exquisitely grown in a skeleton leaf, cut low and square. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars, and Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinker Bell part of the way, and his hands were still messy with the fairy dust. Now, as those night lights went off, there was still a little light in the room, and the light grew up, and that light was actually all the time there, because it was the light from a fairy by the name of Tinker Bell. She was a delicate fairy, only of the size of a human hand, and she was trying to look for Peter's shadow. And Peter had actually left her there, and his hands were even still full of her dust, the dust from the fairy's wings. They were on his hands, and Peter's shadow was in one of those drawers which Tinker Bell had searched for high and low, but she was not able to find it. And later, when they do get it, we see what happens next. Tinker Bell, he called softly, after making sure that the children were asleep. Tink, where are you? She was in a jug for a moment, and liking it extremely. She had never been in a jug before. Now, Peter Pan started to call out for Tinker Bell, and when finally searching for Peter's shadow, she found a jug which she liked, the space of the jug in the jug, and she was there in that. Oh, do come out of that jug and tell me, do you know where they put my shadow? Peter asked Tinker Bell where they had put her shadow. The loveliest tinkle as of golden bells answered, "It is the fairy language. You ordinary children can never hear it. But if you were to hear it, you would know that you had heard it once before. Now, Tinkerbell was a fairy, so they were talking in fairy language, and it was a very soft, very beautiful language which we cannot hear. The fairies are talking to each other. But little children, it's just imagination, children. So the little children have heard these stories so often that they can even imagine those sounds of the fairy. So Ting said that Shadow was in the big box. She meant the chest of drawers, and Peter jumped at the drawers, scattering their contents to the floor with both hands as kings toss halfpences to the crowd. In a moment he had recovered his shadow, and in his delight he forgot that he had shut Tinkerbell up in the drawer. Now Tinkerbell told him that the shadow was in the drawer. His shadow was in the drawer. And so when he opened the drawer, he removed everything from the drawer, throwing everything away. And when he got his shadow, he forgot that Tinkerbell was inside it, and he closed her up inside the drawer. If he thought at all, but I don't believe he ever thought, it was that he and his shadow were brought near each other, would join like drops of water, and when they did not, he was applauded. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but that also failed. A shudder passed through Peter, and he sat on the floor and cried. Now when he got his shadow, he became again he was a very careless, carefree and a childish person. So he forgot about Tinkerbell, and he closed her in the drawer and didn't even want to thank her or say anything for her help. And he kept trying to stick his shadow to himself. He tried everything what was possible for him, even tried to stick it with the soap, but he was not able to. And finally he was so upset with it that he was not able to attach his shadow to himself. He sat down on the floor and started to cry. His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. Wendy was one of the children in that house. So when he started to cry and his sobs, it woke up Wendy, and she sat up. She was not alarmed to see a stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only pleasantly interested. She was not scared. She was happy to see someone there, and she was interested to know what was happening. "Boy," she said courteously, "why are you crying?" She said very soberly, very politely. Peter could be exceedingly polite also, having learnt the grand manners at the fairy ceremonies. He was also very polite because he had learnt a lot of things at the fairy ceremonies. And he rose and bowed to her beautifully. She was much pleased and bowed beautifully to him from the bed. That's how they greet each other. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy, Moira, Angela, darling," that was her name. She replied with some satisfaction. "What is your name?" "Peter Pan." She was already sure that he must be Peter, but it did seem a comparatively short name. She was very sure that it must be Peter Pan or Peter, but the name was very short. She felt that way, and they introduced themselves. "Is that all?" she asked Peter. "Is that all your name?" "Yes," he said, rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was the shortest name. "I'm so sorry," said Wendy Moria Angela. Now, Wendy's name was very long and Peter's name was so short. So he compared and he really actually felt that it was very short. "It doesn't matter," Peter gulped. Gulped is like swallowing. She asked where he lived. "Second to the right," said Peter, "and then straight on till morning." What a funny address. Now his address was already funny. This is the kind of address that he gave. Peter had a sinking. For the first time he felt that perhaps it was a funny address. "No, it isn't," he said. He had a sinking feeling, like a very nervous feeling that his address was also funny. But he says, "No, it isn't." "I mean," Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was the host, that Peter was in her house, so she was the host. "Is that what they put on the letters?" He wished she had not mentioned letters. "Don't get any letters," he said contemptuously. He was not very happy with the idea of what he was telling him, and he just said it very by a care-hang attitude. "But your mother gets letters," she asked him. "That if you don't get, maybe your mummy must be getting letters." "Don't have a mother," he said. Not only had he no mother, but he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought they were very overrated persons. Wendy, however, felt at once that she was in the presence of a tragedy. Now Peter didn't have a mother. He said, "I don't have a mother." And he really didn't even want, because mothers were very strict, overrated people. And Wendy, on the other hand, she felt the tragedy, the sadness that he didn't have a mother. Now Wendy, feeling bad for Peter, she says, "Oh Peter, no wonder you were crying," she said, and got out of bed and ran to him. Now she feels that he was crying because of this reason, that he didn't have a mother. "I wasn't crying about mothers," he said rather indignantly. Just like, again, he was not really bothered, he just said very impolitely, "I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying." He says, "I wasn't crying also." He says, "I was not able to stick my shadow. That is the reason why I was crying." "It has come off." "Yes," she asked. "Has it come off?" "Yes," he said. "Yes." Then Wendy saw the shadow on the floor, looking so draggled, so dull it was looking, and absolutely like a piece of cloth thrown on the ground. And she was frightfully sorry for Peter. "How awful," she said, but she could not help smiling when she saw that he had been trying to stick it on with soap. She found it rather funny that he was trying to stick it with the soap on himself. Obviously, it wouldn't have stuck. Okay, then what happens? Let's see. How exactly like a boy, because boys are very careless as per this, and so Peter seemed to be the same. So she said exactly how careless and silly or whatever you will say, because shadows cannot stick with a soap, very obviously. Fortunately, she knew at once what to do. "It must be sewn on," she said, just a little patronizingly. Patronizingly means she said exactly showing that it should be, that is the right way to do. And so sewing the shadow would be the right way to put the shadow onto Peter. "What's sewn?" he asked. "You're dreadfully ignorant." "No, I'm not." He did not know what is sewing. So he asked, "What is that?" So she said, "You really don't know anything." But she was exulting, means she was ready to quickly do the work, what she had to. In his ignorance, she was actually happy that he was very ignorant and she knew a lot of things. "I shall sew it on for you." my little man," she said. Though he was tall as herself, and she got out her housewife and sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. Just like a housewife who does all the work for people, she took out the needle and thread and she sewed the shadow on his foot. "I dare say it will hurt a little," she warned him. She warned him that maybe while stitching it may hurt him. "Oh, I shan't cry," said Peter, because he's a boy. He tried to show off and he said, "I will not cry," who was already of the opinion that he had never cried in his life. He said, "I don't cry, don't worry, I will not cry." And he clenched his teeth and did not cry. And he pressed his teeth tight and he did not cry. And soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. It was comparing to a cloth. So cloth kept here and there gets creases. So the shadow was a little creased, but now it was stuck to him. "Perhaps I should have ironed it," Wendy said thoughtfully. But Peter, boy-like, was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about in the wildest glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. He thought that he had attached the shadow himself. "How clever I am," he crowed, and he crowed rapturously. "Oh, the cleverness of me!" Now, where Wendy was thinking that she should have probably ironed the shadow and then stitched it, Peter already was very happy and jumping around like a boy. He was like a small boy, but he like that shadow kept that boyishness, innocence in him, and the careless childishness in him. So he did not even realize or tried to even thank her, and he started to tell himself, dancing away around and saying that how clever I am, that I have been, that he is very clever, and he was very happy about his cleverness. It is humiliating to confess that this conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. It is really very bad to say, but this type of character of Peter was actually the fascinating, attractive thing in him. To put it with brutal frankness, there never was a cockier boy, means a boy as arrogant as him. There was no one like that. To make it more on the contrary to the quality that you like, and the same quality a person wouldn't like, it was that he was a very arrogant person, ignorant and arrogant. But for the moment Wendy was shocked. "You conceit," she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. "Of course I did nothing." Conceit means very arrogant again person, she exclaimed, and she said with in sarcastic way, yes, I didn't do anything." She said, okay, I didn't do anything, you did it." "You did a little," Peter said carelessly, and continued to dance. He said, no, you did some little work, you did," and he continued to dance carelessly. So that is Peter's childishness when he has the shadow on him. This type of attitude of Peter, makes him lovable at the same time, and yet the same attitude of childishness and ignorance and carelessness people don't like.